In about an hour, President Joe Biden is set to give his first State of the Union address. At home, Biden faces an approval rating hovering around 40% and Americans upset over rising inflation despite overall economic growth. All this amid that ongoing crisis in Ukraine. How will the president address these issues, and can he reverse the perceptions of his presidency as Democrats brace for what could be a difficult midterm election? Joining us now with more on the president's address are Jason DeSanto, a political speechwriter and debate strategist for members of Congress in multiple presidential campaigns. He is a senior lecturer at both Northwestern School of Law and Northwestern School of Communication. And Michael Steele, the former chair of the Republican National Committee and the former Republican Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. Welcome both of you to Chicago tonight. Jason DeSanto, how much of this speech do you think should focus on the crisis in Ukraine, and what tone do you expect the president to strike on that?
I think a fair amount of it, Paris, has to focus on the issue at hand. These are speeches that take place at one moment in time. They're an opportunity to discuss the past, what's going to come in the future, but they happen right now. And this is what's been dominating people's television screens, social media. It's the big issue, and I think a lot of this speech has to be about it. The tone should be one that is sober. I think that recounts what the president and the administration have done, that builds credibility for the kind of leadership that he's provided, and also offers a bridge into how that same kind of leadership is a contrast, both at home and abroad, on some of the issues that are really going to be pressing for people in terms of the economy.
And Michael Steele, speaking of the economy, the Ukraine crisis might exacerbate some tensions felt here with inflation, the rising cost of gas. How do you expect the president to address these issues?
Well, that's why I think it becomes a little bit more of a challenge for the president, because, while everyone is sort of fixated a little bit on the realities of what Russia's doing, that's not translating into approval for the president. His handling of this crisis so far is not bumping his numbers up. So to Jason's point, while it's important to focus on that, and he will, he still has to bring this back home to the kitchen table, because that's where we're sitting tonight, watching and listening to this speech. So he's got to make it real for us, because, I go out to the grocery store tomorrow, or if I go to fill up my car, I'm going to have a real world experience there. And so he's got to make that understood by the American people that, this is a culmination of events. Dollars that were spent early before he showed up, $8 trillion in spending to sort of deal with COVID and a lot of other things. And now the pressure of this global conflagration in Ukraine, all of this is having an impact on their bottom line. And he has to help them understand not just that, but what he hopes to do about it through his policies through the remainder of the year.
And having an impact on his own approval rating, which, as we said, is hovering around 40%, Jason DeSanto. Historically, does a State of the Union impact the president's approval rating?
Well, it certainly can, because it's an opportunity to speak for sometimes too long of a period of time without being interrupted, to garner a large audience. And particularly in our particular environment now, our communications environment, that's a very unique opportunity. But by the same token, these speeches are so long that often people are not consuming them the way that they consume most of their information these days. It's not in bite-sized pieces necessarily. But he has an opportunity here. To Michael's point, he has the opportunity to speak about economic issues. And I think the point there is to tell a story of progress, to go where people are right now. You cannot convince people that they're in a great economic situation right now. But what you can identify for them is that there has been some progress, and that there are tangible, practical, specific proposals which will help further. And I would take the things from the much larger kaleidoscope of proposals which have been out there and take the ones that are the most middle-class opportunities, things in childcare, for example. Those are the kinds of things that are going to resonate with people. And most importantly, all of this should be within a frame of democracy. And the fact that the point of democracy is so that more people prosper than less, and that power and opportunity are with many, not in the hands of the few. And this is a theme that he's been hitting for a couple of years. The events in Ukraine provide a linchpin, an opportunity to discuss that, but also to provide contrast with what's going on at home, including in that very chamber, because we know what it looks like when a party is enthralled to one person. And that's something that Biden has warned about. It's something that Franklin Delano Roosevelt warned about on the eve of conflict in Europe back in 1939 and 1940.
Right, and certainly in an international context, the president sought to make the point that democracy is threatened around the globe by authoritarian leaders like President Putin of Russia. Michael Steele, we'll get to the GOP rebuttal in a minute, but how unusual is it to see at least three different Democrats giving their own rebuttals representing different factions of the party?
Well, that's the new norm these days after the speech, where not just the opposition from the other political party, but opposition from within your own political party decides to go out there and lay down what they think the president should have said or what the president should be doing. Look, I kind of get that. I mean, it makes sense. Although I'll be honest with you, I'm from the old school. I just send my speech up to the Capitol and call it a day, because in many respects, this speech has become has more value for opponents, for those who have specific agendas, than to the point you just made, focusing the nation's attention on a very critical piece that may be in front of them, the economy, war, or whatever. And if we're in those types of crises, then yes. So I think at this point, I'm not a big fan of having the rebuttals and the rebuttal to the rebuttal. This is the president's moment to give us his assessment, or hopefully in the future, her assessment of the state of our union. Let them do that without all the political, gadflying. And then Americans can, to Jason's first point, listen soberly, as well as hearing, as the president delivering soberly, the circumstances and the situation we find ourselves in. So never been a big fan of the rebuttals by either party, Democrat or Republican, certainly not now the internecine rebuttals from within your own rank and file.
And Jason DeSanto, so much of modern politics is imagery. Is there an impact here of senators like Marco Rubio saying he's not going to be there because he doesn't want to take a COVID test? And there's a few other elected officials following suit.
I don't think so. But I think there is imagery there. And I think the most important image of all is Joe Biden delivering this speech with vigor. We talked a lot, thought a lot about in the past week or so. What is this speech going to entail? How much does it have to be rewritten and recast given what's going on around the world? But a lot of this has to do with Biden appearing to be somebody who's vigorous and on top of it. Some of the most alarming numbers in that poll from the Washington Post and ABC this weekend was not necessarily about the approval rating per se, but about people who just weren't really sure that Joe Biden continued to be up to the task. I think he is, but I think one of the parts of that is describing in a very list-oriented fashion all the steps that have been taken in a prudent, deliberative way to build an alliance. That connotes a certain degree of strength and skill, but also deliver it in a way which is both strong and optimistic. And I think that will have more of an impact than who is or isn't there, and also more of an impact than who is or isn't, to what Michael was saying a moment ago, speaking after him when the audience has dropped off a fair amount.
All right, we're going to have to leave it right there for now. We'll be joined by our guests again later in the program. But for now, our thanks to Jason DeSanto and Michael Steele. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.